introduction, Danny clearly does the real work and I do the glamorous work. So Danny's here and we work together at Green New Deal UK, and you'll get to meet Danny. But yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to come speak to you all. I love coming to Sheffield and to Yorkshire. I actually went to Hull for 3 years with Majid, so we go way back, and it's been wonderful to see his journey to Europe and to meet the different people in the council who have supported him and have been organizing in Sheffield. So my sort of story is I've been a climate activist for a really long time. I'm 26 years old, and the reason I say that is because I feel like those 26 years are 26 years of procrastination when it comes to climate action. 6 months before I was born, world leaders came together in Rio because they felt like there was a lot of crises. There was a crisis in biodiversity, there was a climate crisis on the horizon, and they said we need to do something about it. So they set up multiple processes. They set up a biodiversity UN process, they set up a climate process, they set up a process to fight desertification, thinking that that would be the way that we would avoid these multiple crises. 26 years on, the science is telling us we are far from sort of avoiding the worst impacts of this crisis, and that actually siloing all of these crises has been the wrong thing to do. I'm going to, so yeah, I was born in Canada, but I've lived in London since I was 9, despite this accent I'm trying to get rid of. I promise you I'm a Londoner, but I can't seem to get, I can't get rid of this accent, which is a bit frustrating. So I grew up in London, like I said. I studied in Hull, which was also it was an amazing experience. I think it was the best decision I've ever made, was to leave London and to study in Hull. I went there shortly after they had their own floods, and it was at a point where Siemens, I think, was moving into the city, and there was a huge buzz around green jobs. And it was an interesting time to be in the city because everyone was trying to work out, how do we deal with this big company that's giving us new opportunities, but like how do we train local people to take the job so that it isn't just a new industry that's opened in the city that just brings people in and then we're still left behind. The other interesting thing about Hull you'll know is that you don't just happen to stumble across Hull. You're either going there or you never come across it because it's the end of the line. And for that reason, the city has a really strong culture and identity, but for the first time, it was the first time I'd actually heard about the North-South divide, which just shows you how insulated and what a bubble people in London live in, that I just didn't know that there was this huge divide between communities and between our country, and that people were frustrated, and the city hadn't really received any real investment since the war. And to me that was shocking, and it was the first time that I understood the climate crisis, but the first time I started sort of seeing how inequality was like ravaging our country and how lots of people were angry, which is why when I was campaigning on Brexit, I was probably one of the first people in my organization who said, you know what, I think there's a chance we might lose this. There's so much we're not seeing, and there's so many people we're not listening to. I think people are fed up, and people are on their knees, and I think they might vote to leave the EU because it isn't about the EU, it's because London is not listening to them, and they feel incredibly left behind. So I think that was a really great experience for me to connect with other people, but just to also just see the country and see how the world doesn't revolve around London, and I wish more people would realize that. But yeah, so I've been a climate campaigner. I started off in an organization called the UK Youth Climate Coalition, if you've heard of them, one of the first sort of big youth climate organizations that was self-organizing, and they were doing great campaigns. One of the campaigns I ran with them was to keep climate change in the education. When Michael Gove was Education Secretary, one of the things he wanted to do was remove climate change from the curriculum. even thinking about it now, it just seems so ridiculous, and it was at the time. But we launched a big campaign and sort of won, and were able to keep it in the curriculum. UKYCC also organized delegations to the UN climate conferences to make sure that young people were represented at the UN during these processes. And through that, I've been several times, including at the Paris COP. And when I was there on the night that sort of the Paris Agreement was being gabbled through, it was heartening to see so many of the things that I'd campaigned on had made it into the text. So for example, human rights. Before then, human rights were not mentioned in the climate agreements, and that's concerning because there was a lot of solutions that meant taking over indigenous land and leaving people behind. And so human rights, young people were mentioned in the text, and that how education was a key part of decarbonization. I also campaigned around the idea of a long-term goal, which sadly became 2050, but the idea that we needed to set a date and a North Star for when we needed to make this transition, because up until then we'd focused on temperatures, that we needed to stay below 1.5 degrees, which is the sort of at that point when we pass it, islands start going underwater. But that doesn't mean anything to anyone. What does 1.5 degrees of warming mean? And we felt like a number would be a sort of galvanizing thing. But even in that moment, I knew that wasn't enough, and that this wasn't going to be the thing that was going to inspire us to make change. Fast forward to the start of this year, I started hearing about something called the Green New Deal. I'm going to leave it at that, and we're going to watch a video, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about what the Green New Deal means in the UK and what we're doing. Hopefully this video works. It's a video that was made by Naomi Klein. I don't know if anyone has heard of her. Is a journalist and writer who's written a lot about climate change and the Green New Deal. And then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which is the congresswoman in the U.S. that I'm sure you would have heard of.
Congress in
So that's pretty inspiring. Hopefully soon we'll have a UK version to show. But in the meantime, I don't think it's that different from the sort of narrative and future we want to see here. And the reason I get emotional every time I watch this, because I think it's the first time we've had a narrative as the left of what we want the future to look like. And one of the biggest problems that I've had is that we're always fighting against something. I know pretty well what I don't want to happen. I've never been able to visualize the world that I want to create, and this has done this pretty well. The other thing is that you'll see in this story, it includes a lot of faces and people that normally don't make the mainstream story, right? And the major innovation in the Green New Deal is that it recognizes economic justice and social justice and sees the way that we combat the climate crisis as fixing those two things. The core of the Green New Deal is fixing inequality. That's wage inequality, that's also income inequality, that's inequality of the North and South. Our democracy should not be concentrated in one city. We should have a sort of local democracy, decentralized democracy. The other thing that's super powerful about this story is that so many of these ideas are things that already exist in our country, right? We're so much further ahead than they actually are in the US. And so many of these ideas are ideas that were born here. The idea of a welfare state is something that we have. So I think there's a way we need to reclaim the story and be actually so much of this, cooperatives are a big part of our history. There's so many local ways of working that exist in our country, and sort of reclaiming them and building a new narrative for where we want to go and start bringing people in. A just transition is also going to be really key, and that's one of the reasons I was excited about coming to Sheffield, is that this is going to be sort of the front lines for what a Green New Deal could look like. How do we have this conversation in a city that has an industry that is thinking about like what does it mean for our industry when we want to cut carbon emissions, and how do we engage with workers and say, okay, the just transition needs to include you, and it is essentially a sort of social negotiation we have to have and build this story together. The unions do want to like understand the climate crisis and know the direction that we need to go in. I don't think as Greens and as lefties we've done a good enough job in sharing the conversation instead of going to them and telling them this is what we have to do, being like, this is what we have to do, but how do we do it together? How could we ensure that people have jobs or have a job guarantee or have training guarantees? So the way that the Green New Deal sort of started, again, coming back to sort of the UK, is the idea started here. One of sort of the Greens' biggest names, Caroline Lucas, was one of the originators of the idea of a Green New Deal 10 years ago before the financial crash happened. It didn't pick up because when austerity hits, common sense economics comes in, where people are like, we need to save, so austerity came in and that idea was lost. The people working for this young lady came to the UK to speak to, before she was elected, came to speak to people here. And took the idea back to the US. And it was one of the platforms that she ran on. So now, inspired by the movement that's been created in the US, especially by the youth movement, we saw an opportunity to do the same thing in the UK. So a bunch of campaigners, Caroline's been super involved, but so have a bunch of other people. Like, how can we do this in the UK? And a few of us, admittedly mostly in London, I think that's the real shame, saw a real gap to build. We needed a social movement, like a social movement that went beyond the green movement, that brought in housing campaigners, that brought in migrant rights campaigners, who brought in social and economic justice campaigners, and pushed this idea of a Green New Deal. There's been some success. I'm sure most people will know that Labour have now picked up, at least in name, the Green New Deal. And that's really exciting, and that is because of the work of the Greens, but also campaigners who, within the Labour Party, have been pushing this. So that's a massive success to really have in the space of 8 months, that we now have a major party who is picking up something as radical as the Green New Deal. But the work is not done. Even if, and I say this, like, it's really, we have an election, it's important that we get in a government that isn't the Tories, but also a government that will platform a Green New Deal. But even if we had a Labour government tomorrow, that's not enough. Like, the Green New Deal is going to be tough. No government is going to be able to deliver a Green New Deal without a massive mandate and without a massive movement to keep supporting them, because it's a tough thing to do. And the odds will be against them, the vested interests will be against them. And unless we can build a movement up and down the country that says, like, Green New Deal or nothing, they won't have the mandate to do it. And that's what our job is yes, to push sort of a party to be elected, but more than that, to build a movement up and down the country where we start building that mandate, but also start enacting the Green New Deal in the way that we start working in our communities and building a wider movement that sort of is an umbrella for all of these social struggles and includes everyone in the conversation. So I don't know how much time I've got left.
As much.
Nah.
We do have another speech coming up, and then I thought we can maybe take some questions as well after that.
Great. I would love questions, but one of the things I wanted to do is hear from everyone else, because 90% of the reason I'm here, of course 10% because I was invited to speak, but 90% of it is because I want to hear from everyone else in the room and to see how we can start getting, to hear what's going on already in Sheffield already around a Green New Deal and how we can support that, but how we can also support a local movement around the Green New Deal. And just to hear from everyone else. So I do want to listen to sort of people's thoughts on this, or ideas, or problems, or things that we should be thinking of. So I don't know whether it's best to do that now, or we could do that instead of questions.
How well, Martin, is your speech tie in?
Yeah, so it's like Green New Deal for Sheffield.
Oh,
should we,
brilliant.
Yeah,
Let's listen to Martin.
Can we do questions at the end?
It's quite specific.
Okay, we have one very specific question.
I was just wondering, one of the things that you always see in the news, especially something with Labour, is that it seems like it's either fixing the climate or social injustice. And one of the things I think that isn't maybe publicised enough is how actually the two go hand in hand. If you invest in green technology and if you invest in more sustainable stuff, then actually it kind of fixes a lot of the social injustice. And I suppose one of the things is how can we better communicate that and build on that, because I think the link is missing for a lot of people.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that's the potential that the Green New Deal has, is that yes, it has green in the title, but like the New Deal, which was inspired by what happened in the US, was more about fixing economic and social justice. And I do think it's a link, and the biggest thing is like if we fix the inequality crisis, I honestly believe so many of the things that we want to do to fix the climate will already happen. The way I think we change our conversation is by bringing more people into the room. So it isn't just a bunch of people who are interested in the environment and the climate crisis who are in the room, but like constantly that we have other campaigners who are working on a myriad of issues also in the room. And then we have almost like a united front of like, it's important. If we want to solve the climate crisis, we need to fix the economic inequality. And I think the core of this is we need to fix our economy. Our economy right now puts like profits over people and planet, and we want an economy that works for people and planet, and not for corporations or people who are just trying to sort of make a huge profit at the expense of everything. And I think that has been more in the media. Like, there's the yellow vests have an amazing phrase, which is, if I can remember it, which is end of the world, end of the month, same fight, same perpetrators. And I think that's just a beautiful phrase because it encapsulates the issue that we have. It's the same people who are polluting our planet that are also making huge wealth, whilst the poorest people are having to contend with lower wages and higher living costs. So I think that's, like, for me, that's the key. Like, if we can keep that sort of understanding in everything that we say, it's about justice, it's about climate justice, then I think we can start changing the conversation.
Great.